we will into the self-introductions. And what I'll do is I'll read down my list. If you want to do just a quick introduction on yourself, maybe the organization you work for, your interest in this space of crisis risk management. So Kenneth has some idea of the variety of the participants listening in on the call today. So with that, George Lane, you are number one on my list.
Sorry. George Lane, Emergency Response Technology. I've worked with Rune out at Berkeley in the past. My primary goal is working with portable chemical sensors for industrial applications.
Great, thank you, George. Brandon Johnson.
Sorry. So I'm having a little problem here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you pretty good.
Okay. Yes, I'm a senior scientist with Oregon Research Institute, formerly Decision Research, and I am a specialist in risk perception and risk communication and some policies.
Cool, thank you. Risk perception is always an intriguing area. Giampaolo, you are next on the list, my friend.
Yeah, I'm Giampaolo Rizzeri. I'm an architect and civil engineer. My passion for sustainability led me to become deeply involved in sustainable construction projects across Italy at the beginning, designing sustainable buildings that minimize energy consumptions, carbon footprint. In 2019, I started on a new chapter in my career by joining the electric vehicle charging network development sector. And now as a project manager, I lead teams in planning and design and implementation of EV charging infrastructure across US and Europe.
Great, thank you. It looks like you're in my secondary office, the vehicle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
All right, Todd Laporte.
I'm Todd Laporte, here on the faculty at UC Berkeley. I'm emeritus now, continuing to think about organizations, particularly the effect of exponential change in the organizational operating environment that we're seeing around the world, and the kind of dislocations for organizations that when their operating environments change exponentially, how difficult that is to reconcile with the way we think about organizations based on past understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, Todd, and welcome. Esfandiar, you are next on the list.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, Esfandiar Imani. I'm currently leading the risk management effort and program in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Before that, 25 years in energy industry. That's where I met Rune, Paul, Ian, and the CCRM, got introduced to the CCRM. So glad to be here.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, now my list is shifting around, so I can remember who I called on and who I didn't. Paul, you are next.
Okay, my name is Paul Schulman. I've just hung around CCRM and its meetings for quite a while. Originally, I worked with Todd on some of the early high reliability organizations research, and then with Emery Rowe, looking at systems that are more networked and a little less settled in their technology as HROs. And then now more recently, I'm looking at the problem of how to promote safety without reliability. I think we're reaching the point where the conventional idea of reliability is going to be displaced by more uncertainty, more inter-organizational turbulence and unpredictability. And so I'm trying for the life of me to figure out how can we actually promote safety when we can't rely on the organizations to be predictable and reliable.
Thanks, Paul. So in a hypothetical, would this be something like you're flying on an airplane, a portion of the airplane blows out, but nobody dies and the plane lands safely? Is that what you're talking about?
I think I would attribute that to luck
Ah,
more than actually the promotion of safety, but you never know. I mean,
got it. Yeah, the doors may or may not work, right? That's the reliability component, but I don't think anyone's going to die today. Andres, you are next. Welcome.
Okay, welcome everybody. Andres Acevedo with Valley Water. I've come to these several of these talks over the years, so just want to kind of tune in and see what's been going on. Just a heads up, I will probably be dropping off around 10:50 or so. I've got 11 o'clock I got to get on. So anyway, looking forward to listening today.
Great, thank you. Ian Mitroff.
Ian, I'm a longtime member of CCRM. My primary research is crisis management, for which I conduct seminars for organizations all the time. I'm proud to say that Rune and I have just published a book together on confronting complex problems with the appropriate tools. Anyway, good to be here.
And it's open source, so it's free. Although Amazon is listing it for $110 on Amazon. I don't think Ian and I get a cent of that. I think it all goes to Amazon and the publisher. So get the free one. We'll send off a link. Peter, you are next.
Hi, everyone. Good to see a lot of you again, especially Todd. It's good to see you. Peter Martelli, I'm Associate Professor of Health Administration at Suffolk University, and have been a longtime member of CCRM in various capacities.
Great, thank you, Peter. Natalia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalia Smaluk. I am in Toronto. I really enjoy attending these events whenever I can, so thank you very much, Arun, for organizing them. I run a communication consultancy called NBAU, which stands for Not Business as Usual. I help leaders and organizations navigate different scenarios of communication, which often includes crisis. I have people call me at 5:45 p.m. typically on a Friday afternoon with something that happened. And my challenge always is to try to encourage them to think proactively about crisis planning and training ahead of time. I'm working on a Catalyst article as we speak, which is the global publication of the International Association of Business Communicators, focusing on these issues, and we'll be attending a conference in Chicago with the same organization in June. So really looking forward to this conversation today.
Great, thank you, and welcome back. Nick.
Thank you.
We're unable to hear you. We see your lips moving, but there's no audio. It's always, I got the look that that's a recurring problem. All right, I'll cycle back and see if there's an update on the microphone. If not, if you want to do a little bio in the chat, I can read that off for you. Tony, welcome, Tony.
Hey, thank you. Good to be here. I've got some limited time too, but I'm really interested in the subject and staying in touch with all you folks at CCRM. I'm a professor emeritus, Naval Postgraduate School, where I met and worked with Carlene Roberts for years. And together we developed an organizational safety effectiveness survey based on high reliability organization principles. That was applied to the Navy and still is being used by the Navy aviation community. That program was so successful that it led me to form my own company where I applied that same methodology in commercial aviation, offshore oil, and NASA aviation as well over the years. So that's my claim to fame, and I'm still interested, very interested in high reliability and further thought developments. I'm interested in what the gentleman said about looking at unreliable conditions for safety and so on. So thank you for letting me be here, and I look forward to listening to your speaker.
Great, thank you so much for joining. Robert.
Yeah, I'm Rob Gould from I'm a faculty member at Clark University And I'm new here, so I'm just getting to know you, though I know some of the audience. I know Brandon quite well. And 100 years ago or so, I worked with Todd on a emergency planning for 3 Mile Island. Anyway, Kenneth invited me. I really look forward to this. I'm from the risk community. I'm interested very much in the overlap between organizational theory and risks as they're seen, and risks in the public sphere. Kenneth and I work together in the general area of the social amplification of risk framework.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks for joining. Let's see. Brad, welcome, Brad.
Happy to be here. So my background served as a wildland firefighter, as a hotshot. Got interested in human factors and system safety, investigated accidents, including serving as lead investigator on the Yarnell Hill Fire, where 19 firefighters died in 2013. And now I have a strong relationship with the HRO, theories and ideas and practices and concepts that were really important to us in the firefighting world. And so now what I'm doing with my life is finding ways to translate these principles and practices that served us in that very risky, dangerous environment, and seeing how I can share them with the rest of the world and with other people who work in dynamic, ambiguous, risky, and complex environments. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm glad that you're doing these webinars.
Great, thanks for joining. And yeah, lots of material here and lots of connections to be made, especially on the student front. So there are a lot of graduate students and doctorate students that could really benefit from experiences and guidance such as the one that you have, and probably actually most people on the call here. So hopefully that's a connection we can make in the future. All right, Mark Nichols, welcome.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Yep, self-introductions. You know the routine. You know the drill.
Yes. I work with a group called Citizens Acting for Rail Safety. My interest in particular is hazardous material by rail and prevention of catastrophes involving incidents with that material by that mode. Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, so I think what we'll do, we're running a little behind schedule, so we'll just jump into the introduction here of Kenneth, and I'll hand the baton over to him. During the course of the presentation, Kenneth, do you want people to just speak up or raise their hand, or do you want people to hold off until the end for questions?
Both, actually. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yeah, so feel free. And then also what we can do is if you do have questions, you don't want to raise your hand or speak up, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we can cycle back and just go down the list of questions that are in the chat. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kenneth Pettersen Gould, Associate Professor in Risk Management and Societal Safety at the University of Stavanger. He's interested in how risk, reliability, safety, and security is analyzed and managed in societal and organizational contexts, and how regulatory and management strategies in these areas can be further developed. So with that, I will hand the show over to Kenneth, and I think we can give you the ability to share your screen if all goes well. Yep, I think you got the settings, so let me know if you have any issues. Otherwise, probably what I'll ask folks to do is to turn off your video feed and your audio, just so we don't have strange interruptions for Kenneth here. I know as a speaker, it's kind of nice to see faces and things, but it can also be distracting.
Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now, Rune. Can you see that okay?
Yep, we are looking great. It's all yours.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your introductions, and thank you for the invitation. I just made some few notes here. I think this is a really nice group to be talking about these topics here, but from both risk communication, risk perception, accident, disaster research, disaster management, and also then organizational theory, organizational reliability, and safety. And I hope you will see as I start and go along that I think this kind of is a talk that, in addition to making some specific points, I also try to make some connections here between research agendas and research areas that are not engaging as much as I think they should in terms of the topics that we're talking about. So I hope you'll all be engaging in that. So the background for this talk and this focus is really two, let's say, I wouldn't call them never ending, but they've been kind of ongoing projects and strands of research that I'm involved in. One is the studies of organizations and the management of hazardous technologies. And the other is engaging more and more with risk perception and risk communication research. And that kind of comes from both the, let's say, the environment I work and teaching here across risk and safety studies, but also I think volunteering to attend conferences and try to present papers and present research in both communities. So in addition to those, let's say, those two strands of research, I will, in relation to that, be talking about a specific work that we're doing, and I'm doing together with Paul Schulman, who's here, and also my colleague from Stavanger, Lisbeth Fjæran, who hopefully will at least be joining us for some minutes, on applying the social amplification of risk framework that Rob mentioned here, together with theory on drift in organizations. And we're doing that because we believe it is or can be an important contribution towards explaining how accidents and disaster preconditions can develop over time within hazardous technologies. And we also think that applying this together can help us and provide a stronger background for developing accident and disaster prevention, safety, and reliability. And what I want to do is kind of three points on the agenda. First is to talk a bit about these two, let's say, I will call them, let's say, strands of research, but also research domains. On the one side, risk analysis, and on the other side, organizational accident safety research. From engaging in both communities, find that these two communities share a lot of common interests, but they are almost, well, putting this a bit harsh then, almost strangers to one another. Secondly, I want to talk a bit about two ongoing, let's say, projects that I've been doing. One on, let's say, drift and high reliability organizations, which is very clearly on the organizational accident safety research, reliability research domain. And the other on risk amplification and attenuation processes, which is clearly in the risk analysis domain. And thereafter, I will then connect those in this ongoing project on attenuating risks into disaster. Sounds maybe a bit complicated, but I'll see how I get on. And lastly, I am hoping, Rune, to have enough time for questions, comments, and discussions. So please, everyone, both as we go along and not at least at the end, please engage as much as possible. I would really like to hear your input, reflections, and to discuss with you. First of all, then, from engaging with risk analysis, it became apparent to me that for a long time, let's say, the risk community and risk analysis as a broader group has been engaging with organizational perspectives. And it quite early in the 80s became part of a broader vision for risk analysis as the social scientists were invited in or let's say, invited themselves in to this group and this environment. And the agenda was early on opened up that risk is in very much a social and human phenomena that connects to human construal, cognitive, perception issues, and so on. And that also not just individuals, but also organizations and systems are heavily involved in producing, influencing, and developing risks. And I guess this, well, at least relates to what we can call sociotechnical risks, where organizations and systems produce or develop risks related to activities or technologies and so on. However, when I then looked back in 2020 at this kind of community, this starting vision from the 80s kind of came through as a much more muddled and, let's say, ad hoc engagement, where organizational elements only popped up from time to time in risk analytic work, very much related to individual researchers and kind of related to individual periods or events. This kind of made me pose the question, well, where has all the organizational risk researchers gone? And also, I would say recently, at least the last 10 years or so, I'm kind of feeling that organizational and social issues has become less visible within risk analysis. And just to add, when I say risk analysis, I don't mean just technical risk assessment. I mean, let's say the wider community of research engaging with risk. However, if we look at the other side of the, let's say, of these two strands on safety and reliability research and approaches predominantly then guided by organizational accident literature, as well as high reliability organizations that many of you know a lot about, there is also very little reference to risk analysis that way, beyond calling for risk assessments or technical risk assessment. And although I kind of have found, let's say, a few kind of bodies of work and issues, those have been more, let's say, individually oriented, focusing more on risk perception as an individual cognitive psychological issue than connecting this to more organizational institutional research and so on. And I would say that this kind of, should we call it separation or fragmentation, is I would say very unfortunate and is not what we need in a time, I think, as you, Paul, mentioned, where we're seeing organizational and systems changing very much, where in relation to certain hazardous technologies, it's very difficult now to even identify one, let's say, longitudinal existing organization. We're more talking about supply chains, networks of organizations, networks of systems. And although I'm not talking that much about crisis here, and I'm interested to hear from you that are more on the, let's say, crisis management, crisis part of this, because I think there has maybe been more engagement and linking in relation to risk and risk perception issues, for example, related to naturalistic decision-making and those types of theories. But I think there are a lot of important connections to be made there as well. So that's just the context very quickly. So to move on then to the second part. And this part relates to research that Paul and I did some years ago in a project where we were working with a regional airline here in Norway, looking at their safety management and how they were working to achieve, I would say, high reliability in their operations, but in a condition where, or in an environment where there were I would say, smaller or more challenging safety margins than in civil aviation in general. And we were looking at, well, what are they doing and how are they achieving this? And we found that that it was not, let's say, the large abrupt changes and developments that they were focusing on or engaging with, but their concern was very much with the minor, small adjustments, things that kind of you would suspect many organizations to not focus on or think about, but that for them was important issues to look at. And I think it was Paul here that coined the phrase reliability drift as here an important variable to consider. And that this also connects to other research that has been done on high reliability organizations and in those types of settings. And what we found here is that looking at how they were working over time with achieving their, let's say, the reliability in their operations, this was not just, let's say, through, let's say, a static, fixed, procedural, strict rules and regulatory system, but they were actually very much attempting to manage fluctuations in both, I would say, cognitive variables and aspects and behavioral issues and responses. So we're talking here both about, let's say, issues like mindfulness, trust, sense-making, communication between actors, communication and cooperation between members in order to, let's say, make sure that these fluctuations, these variations were in what we can call expected bands. And in many situations, these bandwidths were quite narrow in terms of the types of operations that they were running. We see here that this is an airline that were running quite large aircrafts on small airports and also at high frequencies, meaning many landings and takeoffs each day, with safety records comparable to other actors in civil aviation that we know from more long runway operations and so on. So they were in a way operating with smaller margins, or we could say perhaps also use the concept or word higher risk, but with the same, let's say, level of reliability and safety in their operation. Yeah, and what I want to emphasize here then is that the drift that we're talking about here, and I'm maybe moving a bit quickly now with drift, but I'm guessing that many of you know the concept a bit from before, but that the drift here can be both let's say a cognitive process, but also a behavioral response, behavioral issue, with changes then in both action, but also, let's say, more cognitive shifts in terms of sense making and so on. And here, when we talk about drift, we were talking about reliability in particular, but we will see later that it can be connected also to other issues. And here we defined it as the migration of cognitive and behavioral variables which support reliability outside of bounded bandwidths that I was mentioning. And what is important then is also to think about how does this then affect and linked to let's say safety or what we can say preconditions for accidents. And the core issue here is not necessarily the drift. Oh, sorry about this. The drift in itself that is, let's say, the direct risk for let's say unwanted developments or accidents. But it is the drift, let's say, implying organizational change that is not recognized, seen elsewhere in the organization or beyond the organization. and that the reliability drift, therefore, or through this, connects to let's say, loss of system integration, or as also Paul put it here, this is a presentation from when he was summarizing this in 2016, the rise of representational error. And what happens then is that the organization or the members of the organization no longer have an understanding or precise enough understanding of organizational practices and what the effects are for the whole system. And this leads to a loss of awareness of the risk state of the organization. And it's here that we will see that let's say the foundations for what we call incidents and accidents and disasters, I think, lie in relation to this type of drift in particular. So that's that HRO organizational theory strand. And now I move on quickly to the third strand. And I know I'm moving a bit quick here, but it's just to make sure that I get to the main part of the presentation afterwards. These are kind of building blocks, so bear with me. And this connects specifically to the research that Rob mentioned here, and I'm delighted, Rob, that you're here as well, and also Brandon, that I know from the risk community and others. And this strand of research kind of came from, let's say, from well, not just myself, but others looking into or looking at how risk perception and risk development processes were approached within the risk community, and finding that risk studies were very much paying attention to, at least in an organizational context or a social process context, to how risks get defined. Should pay more attention to how risks get defined and redefined over time. Very much, perhaps a bit comparable to, I guess, where organizational accidents or organizational safety research departed from, let's say, the work of Turner and Perot and others in the late 70s, early 80s, that, okay, why are we not looking more at what precedes or what comes before significant events, significant assessments, significant risk events, and so on. And also in this, that risk studies should pay more attention to the different actors, including also the expert actors themselves in these processes. And for me, this work was a very interesting way of also connecting back to how we can connect concepts and issues like risk perception and risk communication to, let's say, my other research agenda on organizations and hazardous technologies. And to me, it was very kind of important to think then what is the connection there between perceptions and actions and responses. And as I talked about in relation to drift before, also here when we talk about risk perception, we're on the one side talking about the cognitive side of it, but in this type of work and in this type of understanding, risk perceptions also need to be connected to actions and responses. And how, let's say, risk perceptions are also, let's say, individual and social organizational acts, so to speak. So it's kind of a broad way of thinking about how risk perception then becomes woven into systems and becomes part of practices. And in this specific work, we're applying some actor network theory also from Stephen Hilgartner in terms of using the concepts of risk emplacement and risk displacement to describe, let's say, how, let's say, speech acts or so on get woven into sociotechnical systems. And what we do here also is look at how can we then make use of and extend the social amplification of risk framework. I will get back to this framework a bit later on, but this has become an important framework for connecting different theories, connecting different levels, connecting different parts of how risk processes develop within risk perception, communication, risk analysis, research. And we are thinking, and I am thinking, that it has applications and value also in applying it in organizations or in understanding of risk processes in sociotechnical systems. This is a framework that has been applied a lot on, let's say, what happens after a risk event, after an accident or a disaster, very much to explain how risk perception, communication processes develop among the public or in society at large. But I think also it has a lot of value in trying to apply and develop it also within the context of organization. But what we then need is a framework that also looks upstream to the context and the events that precede a major risk event and a disaster. That organizational socio-technical context that we often look at as, let's say, accident or safety or reliability researchers. And specifically, I think it is important then to characterize the risk attenuation that occurs in these phases, or let's say the relationship between risk amplification and risk attenuation. And I think this is important for at least two aspects. One, and this is what we were exploring in the paper with Rob and Lisbeth that I just showed on a previous slide, is that these developments actually contribute a lot to understanding the social experience of risk after events. We know from before that people don't just care about the specific event or what was said in a specific risk assessment or response, but they actually care about what were people, experts, the system, the responsible actors doing with the system before the event happened. And that has implications for their risk perception. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that I think it also can contribute to understanding how the dynamics in the social processing of risk contributes to increase the risk of accidents and disasters, we say more directly or more specifically. And I think that's also a key contribution. And that is the main part of this part 4 and what we are now trying to develop and think about. Okay, so as I have been trying to, let's say, give a background to here, both theory on drift in organizations and the social amplification of risk framework acknowledges that there are processes through which sociotechnical risks develop. That the processes through which sociotechnical risks develop, that they are dynamic and relate to communication and risk perceptions and responses across different contexts and phases. And to try to specify it and maybe simplify it a bit, I find that this means that there are similarities here in focusing on communication and information issues. But despite of this, I have not found, or we have not found, many attempts in the literature towards applying the SARF, or let's say applying or approaching issues of risk perception and risk communication with theory from the study of organizations, accidents, and the management of hazardous systems. And what we then try to pick out from this research agenda, because I think it is a research agenda, I think there are a lot of aspects and issues that could be addressed here, is to show how less visible risks or risks events can be attenuated in the communicative practices of organizations or in organizations over time, across both the, let's say, the pre-assessment that is done in organizations, the risk framing that is done in organization, the planning and assessment activities, as well as the more real-time management parts of the organization. And we are wanting or trying to use the SARF then to facilitate identifying different types of drift that are linked to risk communication and risk perception, and showing how drift can spread in and across organizations in ways that contribute to or can contribute to accident and disaster risk. And lastly, we're wanting or attempting to discuss implications for prevention, safety, reliability. Now, saying that this is a totally new agenda and not been addressed before is not entirely right. There have been some researchers, there have been some, let's say, important developments along the way. And here are a few of them. Freudenberg, who's unfortunately I never met or died quite early, did some important work on this over many years in terms of explaining how social processes prove to amplify and or attenuate risks themselves. And also Nick Pigeon, both from his work with Barry Turner that some of you may know, but also in his work within the, let's say, I would say, risk perception and risk analysis community, has voiced and pointed the way in terms of the possibilities of linking risk amplification to the empirical base of knowledge concerning organizational processes related to high reliability, large-scale failures, and disasters. And that this could be an important way of extending and developing the SARF, the framework. And also in political science, we find this is the European context, Rothstein from London did some work also in the early 2000s on how organizational perceptions of risks are perhaps not that different from other human perceptions of risk that we see more in the public domain, in order to explain how then there are, let's say, aspects of risk attenuation, dampening of risk, or amplifying of risk that goes on also within, let's say, the most archetypical risk bureaucracies. And he, in this research, has some interesting case studies parsing out some of these issues. Also, I think, or I'm hoping maybe that some of you who know the accident disaster literature identify some connections and issues to some of, let's say, the most prominent and most applied, I would say, accident disaster theories and approaches. I think Barry Turner's work on documenting the systematic sources of misinformation in organizations that contribute to disasters. Many of these information difficulties, I think, can be seen as contributing to or causing risk attenuation prior to events. And also, if we look at Diane Vaughan's work on the Challenger launch decision, she shows or found how changes in the political and managerial environment surrounding NASA trickled down from the top in a way that normalized the deviant performance of critical technical components. I would say also an aspect of that can be connected to risk attenuation. And I think maybe these can be two of more examples. And lastly, I think there is also, I think, an important strand or important research that we can connect to this in a way as a counterpoint to the accident analysis the work that Todd Laporte, Paul Schulman, and others, Ian and others who have been working in high reliability organizations research have identified what we can call structural and cultural characteristics that in this case amplify even minor risks, so as to achieve high attentiveness to risk reduction throughout the organization. And I do think that high reliability organizations research is one important place to look in order to think about and develop, let's say, the strategies and issues that can help us in terms of, let's say, dealing with or managing these risk attenuation processes that we are talking about. Okay, so there is some background out there to help us, luckily. Now then, so how are we applying the social amplification of risk framework? Well, I'll try here to give a kind of quick tour and a brief example. Some of you know this, some of you may not know it, but the SARF was developed back in the late 80s in an attempt to give a holistic picture of the risk perception and risk communication process. To the right here, you see one of the most used or still is, let's say, an early developed graphic or figure linked to the social amplification metaphor in terms of explaining how these processes can develop. And I'll get back to how we are applying this figure. But what the SARF then tries to explain is how risk and risk events interact with psychological, social, institutional, and cultural processes in ways that can amplify or attenuate risk perceptions and related responses. And an important part of this is using the amplification metaphor to describe then how different actors generate, create, receive, interpret, and pass on risk signals, and how this has consequences also then for behavior and outcomes. An important, and I guess also much applied part of this approach or figure is what has been known as, let's say, the ripple effects, that also explains then how responses, consequences then can have ripples that extend beyond the specific organizational or social context, either vertically to other levels of management or government, but also horizontally or geographically to other contexts, other places, and other issues. And I'll also get back to this related to some of the drift that we're trying to theorize. So that's very briefly the amplification framework. Well, how are we applying this then in organizations, and how do we think it can be applied in organizations? Well, here is a very simple illustration, and I'm curious if this will work and if you will be with me in this. But if we see here then that one of, let's say, what we can call type of risk events that can be linked or part of risk attenuation processes could be, for example, a report on decline or no accidents in the organization or the system the last year. Such a report could in many ways be seen as, I would guess, like a typical, maybe a non-event in relation to safety developments and so on. But what we're trying here to say is that these types of safety or reliability events also have consequences. But we see here that they carry different signals, they have different impacts than, for example, accidents and disasters. And the signals that they carry here can easily be, let's say, well, interpreted as the risk of accidents has declined or is low. And this perception is then further carried on with responses, with consequences, and many of these also can be more minor, more hidden, more difficult to maybe comprehend or identify, but it can be issues such as reduction, small reductions or adjustments in the training of personnel, reducing investment in maintenance, and so on. These are just some examples. And this again can have, let's say, additional consequences in perceptive issues such as more relaxed attitudes to safety in the organization, maybe at the more strategic level, a shift in focus to focus on other risks or other values such as production. Sorry, is there anyone speaking? Ah, okay, maybe someone's mic's on, I don't know. Okay, and we also see here the ripple effects, that we're also thinking that as these processes develop, this, let's say, reports of, let's say, or information from systems saying that we can produce more, we can, reliability is less important, relaxing attitudes, that can have impacts on then, for example, reduced political pressure or shifts in regulation. And these are what we see then as what we call risk attenuation processes in organizations, and also how they then can migrate or ripple to other contexts, both related contexts or more unrelated contexts. Now, as you see here, this is a very kind of simplified linear description of this process. We are thinking, as also the SARF highlights, that in real contexts and organizations and processes, these issues are a lot more dynamic and interactive, where we see that, of course, ripple effects like this can feed back and have consequences to, for example, attitudes to safety in the organization or otherwise. And I'll get a bit back to this. Okay, I have a few more minutes, I think. What we are also trying to do then is try to identify then what we call risk events with potentially high signal value for drift. And this is, in a way, trying to connect or use, let's say, previous work on this related to events with signal value for risk amplification. But we think there are other risk events that contribute to risk attenuation. And I'm moving a bit quickly here, so make sure that I get through. Here are just some examples of these. But it can be things like reports that an organization has had no accidents or incidents the last year that I used here in the examples. The example, news reports that there were no interruptions in production in the last month. And here you see how these can, let's say, how certain signals can be extracted or certain interpretations are extracted from this on this side here. And this we feel is, let's say, an important part of this theorizing or this development, as these can become, let's say, important cues or issues for organizations to be attentive to or focus on. Now, to the drift part. I need to get to this as well. Drift here, we are connecting to risk attenuation as the effects and implications of these risk perception processes. But what is then important to note here, as I was mentioning, is that the effects here can be quite interrelated and dynamic, and that the drift here follows risk attenuation, let's say, more over time, and is less visible than those changes that we often say identify as resulting from risk amplification. And following the work that I talked about earlier that Paul and I was engaged in, we're connecting, let's say, trying to connect the consequences of risk attenuation to 3 different types of drift: practical, organizational, and societal. And here you see a very brief, let's say, overview of these 3 types of drift. And if we have time, I'll just very briefly go through this. Practical drift, I think, is maybe the type of drift that many of you have read about or heard about before, among other related to Scott Snook's work on the shoot down of the 2 Black Hawk helicopters over Iraq. This is what we see the more direct, let's say, behavioral or communicative effect of risk attenuation, which is more local and behaviorally anchored shifts in organizations or systems. And I think that Snook's work is a very good example of this, where, let's say, how few enemy engagements during these, let's say, first Iraq war operations was interpreted by many in the system as implying that the mission strategy and structure were over-controlling and unreasonable, and that this led to risk attenuation or attenuating the risk of enemy engagement. And people then started to adjust their behavior according to their perceptions. And that this over time resulted in a system with multiple sets of uncoordinated behaviors, each based on a different subunit's risk perception. Organizational drift, we are describing more as a shift in safety goals, in values, for example, in the direction of production, and how these are then absorbed into leadership or the structure of their organization over time. And here I think that Vaughan's example or research on the Challenger disaster is a very relevant example. Societal drift as a, let's say, 3rd level or issues is maybe easy to think about in terms of being a ripple effect, and can be, let's say, an effect of risk attenuation in a system and organizations or an organization that over time, let's say, influences or impacts, let's say, the balance of different concerns for risk or levels of dread or levels of concern relative to other values in society. And these also, we think, are not easily noticed. And sometimes we also see that they are, let's say, masked or let's say, influenced or pushed more into effect also by the amplification of other risks. I remember I did some work years ago, quite some years ago on how, let's say, the risk of terrorism motivated the Norwegian aviation industry to very quickly impose new measures and restructuring a lot of their airports, forgetting to think about what implications this could have for aviation safety. Okay, just very briefly then on some dynamics here then, because as I've been trying to mention that although we present this as a very linear kind of basic model, we think that in practice, these 3 types of drift are often interconnected. And we think that organizations or systems of organizations can be confronted with and susceptible to all types of drift, also at the same time, as well as the interactions between these. And we think that for organizations managing hazardous technologies in particular, it is important to learn more about these three types and how they can produce unexpected outcomes and effects. And actually, we're now back at the airline that Paul and I was working with earlier, trying to see if we can apply some of this in a smaller project that we're doing together with them. I think, this is the last slide, I think. And as I said, we're also wanting to think, and this is where it would be great to hear also some of your reactions and inputs. Well, what does thinking about accidents and disasters in this way mean also then for trying to prevent them or developing? I hear, Paul, you were not that optimistic about developments at the moment, but hopefully we can still, at least in some context, talk about wanting to develop safety and reliability. And I think there then at least it's important then to think about this in terms of countering risk attenuation and how to then deal with these types of drifts. And here I think that, as I said then, that there may be ways then to also then engage with the positive aspects of drift. I know many of you also use the concept or know a lot of the research going on applying, let's say, resilience as a word and as a concept. And in some ways, resilience can be seen as, let's say, an appreciated, understood, and seen drift. At least if we look at it in, let's say, a pre-crisis, pre-emergency phase, where organizations then may, because drift is also what we can think about as, let's say, a positive adaptation. If we are aware of and change and learn and extracting knowledge from that drift. And this can be then ways of preventing the development of misrepresentation and this, let's say, condition of representational error that we're thinking is a core vulnerability or a challenge in relation to the development of disasters. And that was where I was thinking to end, Rune. Should I stop sharing the screen here, or how should I do this?
Why don't you leave the slides on there? Folks may have questions on a particular slide, so you can navigate to it. Let's see, did we get any questions in the chat? We did not. So it is an open forum. So if somebody has a question, feel free to, maybe we'll raise our hands. And then I'll let Kenneth kind of manage the list there so you can call on folks. Don't everyone speak at once. No 50 hands at once.
This is Tony. I have a couple of questions. In my field of applying survey methodology, we take a snapshot of an organization and go to the front line and ask how well they are complying with HRO principles in their safety management. And we get answers. We get incredibly candid and I think valid answers that we bring back to management. But it's a snapshot. So it measures their perception at a point in time based on the current conditions or the immediate history. So my question is, do you have any idea the timeliness of the drift from one state to another in an organization, whether the drift is improved reliability or less reliability? Are you developing metrics, or are you looking at ways of assessing that in the practical application of your theory? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I respond to each question, Rune, or should we collect a few so we get the discussion going? What do you think?
Why don't you go ahead and start addressing those questions, and then I'm sure that will spark other questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think my answer to this is no, that we're not developing this. But among other things, in the previous project that I mentioned that Paul and I were involved in with the airline, we tried to identify projects where the airline was doing this. And we did find that they were actually in their work trying to do what you here, I think, asked for. I can send you an article I wrote or a book chapter where I try to describe this. We are also now doing a survey, a more explorative survey in the airline that connects to how the pilots are receiving and managing and working with risk. But that very much follows, let's say, the constraints of a survey, as you say, that it will very much be a snapshot.
Okay,
Kenneth?
thank you. And I would appreciate you sending me the article, because I see that the things that I'm doing can benefit from the foundation of your theoretical development. Thank you.
Kenneth, I have a question for and maybe a
Sure.
comment as well. First, those slides that Kenneth showed on drift and reliability are as much his, if not more, ideas than mine. So I don't want to make it seem as if I came up with those. Certainly not. Secondly, here's the thing that's interesting to me. The concept of risk is not neutral in this issue of amplification and attenuation. The concept of risk implies that people have mastered the understanding of the hazard and the likelihood. And that, in a sense, gives people can give people either a false security. There's an interesting report just the other day on Boeing's development, of course, of the 737 and the MACP system, or whatever it's called, that took over the guidance of the aircraft. And they had several crashes. The FAA was under pressure. Why are you continuing to let them fly when there were already at least one, possibly two, and they actually let the plane fly, and another crash happened from the same problem. And when people looked at this, they found, well, the FAA did a risk analysis, and they found that actually letting it fly was no riskier than other things that they had tolerated in airlines. And so therefore, they simply let it continue. Well, part of this is the confidence that their risk assessment numbers allowed them to make this judgment. But in many cases, we should be talking more about hazard rather than risk, because we don't understand the likelihood. That's a great uncertainty. And so I just want to point out to the idea of risk, when used by professional risk analysts and even regulators and product producers, can seriously be an attenuation factor in their own behaviors and possibly reassuring some parts of the public. The other thing that happens is the concept of risk, when the public hears it, they don't think about the probability issues. So they may think, oh, it's a risk, this is terrible. They may not have an idea. They should be talking about hazard instead. So I think there's an odd sort of dynamic here where the concept word of risk itself has a non-neutral impact on the processes of, quote, risk attenuation and risk amplification.
Well, thank you, Paul, for your kind words about the slides there, and I'm well, to be honest, I'm very sure they would not have developed and looked the same without our collaboration. So at least you have part of the stakes in them. But of course, any way I'm describing it now is my responsibility entirely. And also thank you for this input and reactions. If it's okay, if there was other, this is really interesting, important, I think, but maybe we should move on with a few more questions, and maybe we can get back to those issues. Maybe others will also, Paul, be commenting on some of the same issues. So
yeah, I think was it Mark or Robert that had their hand up next? Is that Mark?
Yes, Mark, I did.
Okay.
May I go ahead?
Please.
I appreciate the presentation. Quite interesting, and I have lived with the consequences of this in a prior life. Just a couple of quick words about means of addressing this. In a prior life, as I mentioned, I was responsible for probably about a dozen production environments using similar equipment and similar processes. And what I found to be helpful in attempting to prevent serious injuries, fatalities, was the ability to conduct periodic audits in which we did both managerial and operational reviews, not only walking the production floor and looking for things that have been missed in terms of controls, but also digging down into processes and procedures and the documentation of those to verify or to highlight situations where misses were occurring. The other channel was that we had monthly calls with the safety managers from these various sites and shared information about emerging hazard situations and controls that then allowed us to translate that across different production environments and thereby reduce risk overall. But it was a constant battle in that a facility that had not had a loss in a period of time did tend, I think, to, as the presenter has indicated, a bit let down their guard because they were cruising on the past accomplishments or had the risk of doing that. So I just thought I'd offer that perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, so Kenneth, are you just collecting comments, or did you want to respond to that?
Well, I could, but it's just great to get all of you engaged and involved. So I'm thinking maybe if there are not specific questions, then we can move on a bit, and I'm making notes here, and will also respond myself to some of these issues.
Okay, so then I have a few comments, but I think they can be interpreted as questions or at least issues that you might address. The first, I want to just, as a representative of the risk field, I think I should just comment to Paul that these are indeed vexing issues. The field itself is not unaware of them, but anyway, they're vexing issues, and we can talk more if that seems germane. The comment I wanted to make, Kenneth, was a general comment about drift. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I really enjoyed your presentation. The drift, as I heard you talk about it, is represents, in effect, invisible changes. And that seems very important, these changes as they happen that are invisible, so that it can have their effects, and these can even accumulate. Now, there are also blindnesses in organizations and in the public that are more intrinsic. These are sometimes called heuristics. They're called there are various kinds of ways which things don't get seen. And I mean, an example is the Challenger and the study of one thing clearly realized is you saw both effects. You saw accumulating blindnesses over time, but the blindnesses, as she points out, were built in part from the beginning. You had two kinds of perspectives on what the shuttle program was. That on one hand, it was heroic space exploration, and on the other hand, it was to function like an airline with tourists. And those also produced a kind of blindness. So what I'm thinking is that, in fact, that distinction is not totally sharp, and that it matters to be taking into account both at the same time. So you might comment on that. The other thing I'm thinking is that one of these happenstances of drift or blindness is suddenly exposed. Something bad happens that people weren't expecting for that reason. Those conditions of surprise are conditions of great stress. The reaction to them is not necessarily going to be altogether sensible. And it may be, as one's thinking about the whole social amplification process, that it's worth really, in this context, thinking about how people react under conditions of surprise. So anyway, I'd be glad of your comments when you choose to make them.
Well, thank you, Rob, and just to the first issue, I think you're right. If I understood it correctly, then that you're talking about that there are, for many activities and processes, different values that we are wanting to achieve or ascribe to or relate to, not necessarily just safety or reliability, but also innovation or production or research or space exploration, as the case is here. And I think you're right that those are issues to think about, and that was thinking in a context where safety kind of trumps everything is very rare a context to be thinking about this in. And I think those forces are also there. I'm not managing to think clearly if that necessarily directly leads to attenuating the risks. I'm thinking that if you want to prioritize production or space or exploration, you want to do that on the best possible knowledge also of what makes you safe or reliable or whatever. But I guess there can also be interactions and issues there that you need to think about. The second issue, actually, I didn't managed to note it clearly enough because I was thinking too much about the first. But I have made a note of it, so maybe you can repeat afterwards. But there is another hand as well, Hamed. Rune, should we bring Hamed in as well?
Hey, Kenneth, thank you for your time and presentation. Just a quick question. Mine is more of a question than a comment. When we are observing these three types of drift in an organization, what are the barriers that we can put in place in order to bring us back to the path, into the original path? The reason I'm asking this question, listening to your presentation, I feel like drift is not because that there is no barrier in place, is because that the barriers that they existed in place as a result of time, because of the incremental moves, it's become weak, or it's become not effective. So in my mentality of risk management, I always think of a barriers needs to be in place. Now the question is that, do we need to place new barriers in order to avoid the drift, or do we need to look at what we had in place and strengthen it, or come up with some sort of program to update and renew? Thank you.
Yeah, well, as I was talking about briefly towards the end, I think your question kind of relates to the issue of drift, let's say, or let's say the variability, or let's say the change in behavior or cognition, or let's say perception, or well, it depends on what type of barriers we're talking about. But I guess that it's talking about, okay, are we aware of this? Is this something that we're noticing and that we know about, and that we, let's say, share information and talk about? And of course, if we do that, we can identify, is this something that is positive or negative for the organization, and let's say for safety or reliability, or maybe it's important for production. But that is, I guess, it's those types of processes that first and foremost prevent this from becoming a development that is unrecognized, unappreciated, misunderstood, and so on. Of course, sometimes that can be hard. There can be many issues intervening in those processes. It can be, let's say, knowledge deficits. It can be lack of, I don't know, personnel. It can be time issues, many issues that relate to that. But I think that is maybe more important than necessarily, or it should be based on that type of information, you would then impose or think about what type of barrier to introduce. I think maybe just in the blind introducing more barriers can maybe even further intensify the possible implications of the drift, if you understand what I mean. So I think that it's these types of processes related to the types of subtle, small changes that we're talking about that are important, because I don't think we're talking about necessarily, Rob, invisible change. We're talking about change that I think many organizations overlook, or don't appreciate, or don't put the time and resources into identifying. But I think it is, well, so it's invisible. It's not because we can't see it, but it's because we're not looking, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean. We could call it not looking. That's the kind of thing that that I meant. And as part of the first point I was making is that there are many reasons for not looking. And some of them come out of drift, but some of them are just natural ways in which people, for various reasons, don't look.
Yeah, it makes me think about this catchphrase from, or let's say wording from Barry Turner, that let's say one way of seeing is also a way of not seeing, and that there are implications of in the priorities and choices you make, and that has, let's say, I won't say deterministic, but at least there are some dependencies there in how then systems or organizations develop.
Right. And that's partly why I brought up the Challenger case, right? There were incoherent views of what the shuttle program was doing. And that incoherence led to blindnesses or I shouldn't use the word, you just told me not to. It led to not looking at things that should have been obvious.
Todd, have you got your hand up?
Yes, I do. Thank Kenneth. That was very interesting. A wide reach you're pursuing here. I began to think about different kinds of hazard and risk, and one of them is when the benefits of the activity and its long-term disasters are separated. So you get the benefits, but if it's wrong, you don't get the risk expressed for, let's say, a generation. How do you think about that? This body would take into account a lot of environmental risks that we discover later on have been building for in terms of the character of the hazard. We don't recognize the hazard at the same level we recognize the benefits initially. And I suspect there will be a lot of those coming up in the future.
Well, I think you're pointing at a crucial issue of misrepresentation that we as a society are really struggling with, is how should we represent future generations in the decisions being made about technologies today. I think I'm better at pointing at the limitations, both in economic models and societal models for decision making, than pointing at the solutions and how to do that. But I think that this is because, of course, knowing what the values of people or future generations will be is how we conceive of things, at least in terms of decision making, almost impossible, because they're not there to be represented in the processes and so on. I often, when I have those types of issues, go to my children and ask them what do they think. And usually you get very sensible and truthful answers. Not sure what that was the answer you wanted, but it also reminds me a lot of the early critique and issues that Charles Perrault was raising in normal accidents, for example, not focusing on his system accident theory specifically, but more the critique he was raising about the challenge we have as a society for dealing with these types of problems and issues that you're talking about. And I remember his point is that, and this maybe also connects to Paul's issues, that actually what we look at as, let's say, a biased social rationality seems to far or be maybe a much better foundation for deciding about these technologies than a technical rationality, because you see there in social rationalities that some of these heuristics or fears and I don't know, fear and other aspects related to how these risks are perceived, well, to make sense, are more human and sensible. So I would say ways of making sure that these types of social rationalities are more represented and a stronger part of decision making. I still think those points make really, there's a strong argument for that.
Well,
And yeah,
what I was taken by, this is really a reason for not looking. If the damages are beyond your generation, we tend not to look at them.
Yep.
To pick up the last point, which is a pretty important one, I guess the last question I would have would be more like, do you have means of estimating the degree of drift from small to large? Some way of helping us understand the magnitude of a deviation like that?
Well, my first reaction to that would be, well, if you as an organization take the time and sit down and start looking for it, you will very quickly start finding it, I think. So it's an issue of priority and putting together, let's say, the capacities you need to do that. And of course, that comes at a cost, I think. But I think that's where to start. In terms of, let's say, understanding the magnitude, I think very often that hinges on contextual, let's say, knowledge and understanding. Do you need people who are, let's say, and it also depends, I guess, also on the maturity of the technology or the system that you are talking about. Drift in relation, well, drift with respect to what are you drifting from in a certain extent? I guess for some unmature technologies, or let's say for technologies like space exploration, you are to a certain extent relying on drift even to have some hope of success, maybe. Yeah, so I think that can be highly dependent on what context, what kind of technology or system you are talking about or wanting to address.
Thank you.
Is there anyone from, let's say, more the crisis management, crisis? I was interested to hear also about the experience of this, let's say, these two worlds of risk analysis and, let's say, compared to crisis management. We also see here at university, we have courses on the one side, risk perception, and on the other side, crisis management and naturalistic decision making. And when we put them in the same room, we see they are very much talking about the same things, but in different contexts. I'm not sure, Ian and others, have you had those types of experiences? If you're still there. I can only see a black screen at the moment.
Well, let me respond from the standpoint of crisis management.
Oh, good.
Yes, there are a lot of similarities, but the differences are also great and profound. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but the one thing we've been able to do in crisis management is to elucidate the different kinds of potential crises. And a big part of crisis management is the construction of worst case scenarios, thinking the unthinkable. The other part of it that I don't have time to go into is that a lot of crisis management is based on thinking by clinical psychologists, organizational sociologists. For example, a big part of crisis management is overcoming denial mechanisms, which you referred to under another name, namely why so many people deny that they are prone. And that last thing I'll just talk about briefly, there is a huge difference between proactive and reactive organization. Proactive organizations do everything they can, not just to prepare for one crisis, because no crisis ever happens by itself. It either is a result of previous crisis or it sets off. So it's part of a chain reaction. So to prepare for one and only one is not to be prepared. Lastly, there's a difference between a crisis plan and a crisis program. A crisis program says, how is it embedded in an organization? Do you have a crisis management team who's in charge of administering it? How often does a crisis team get together? And do they review their fundamental assumptions why something will or will not happen? So yes, while there are commonalities, there are also big differences. Yeah, risks are political. Not everybody sees them the same way. The same thing happens with crises. So different stakeholders have a different view of the organization and its intended risks and potential crises. But that is all part of crisis management. Let me stop with that, give an indication that there are profound differences.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. I see there are a few more hands. Natalia?
Hey, well, thank you very much for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I'm reflecting on this with my consulting lens. And what often happens is a little bit of the confusion in the terminology between crisis management and risk management in my experience. For example, organizations come to me on the tail end of crisis management when it's really pressing for them to communicate. For example, when they get a media request and it's very, very challenging, or when they need to announce something internally that they have been aware of for the last couple of months. And then they're in crisis management mode. But when I tell them, hey, we should have thought about this 5 months ago, because this is something that is a predictable surprise, they're not comfortable using the terminology of crisis management. They want to talk about all of a sudden risk assessment. And I am comfortable speaking whatever language the client wants to speak, but it also is very different in different contexts. In the context of airlines, it's a very mature crisis and risk management environment. And today I'm working with a medical devices client who is a global organization, but they consider themselves a startup, and their mindset is very much investor relations driven. So it would be a very big uphill battle to convince them of what needs to happen for them to do risk analysis and assessment and research and think about crisis management, even though I do know that in the US market, there already has been an FDA alert. So safety and security is definitely something that should be on their agenda, and it's not for the launch in the Canadian market. So this is just kind of trying to translate different realities and languages used in different contexts, just in the language that works for a specific client is something that is an interesting challenge in my experience.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. That it's good to have that reminder also how closely linked our research is to practice, and also how a lot of our theories are very much validated about related to their practical use, and I appreciate that input. There was another hand here. Who was that?
That was mine, and I just thought, well, first of all, I really appreciated the two comments about complexities and crisis management. And that was what I was trying to get at with the second point that you didn't write down, which was just that these surprise situations, when drift or other reasons for not looking at things are suddenly exposed by something bad or moderately bad. So there is a crisis, and it was a crisis. It was a surprise. And I just was thinking that these surprise conditions are not necessarily conducive to really sensible reactions. And it's good that there's been a lot of study of this, and that probably means you have to think about it, or it will be useful to think about it as part of the whole social amplification problem, that if drift and other reasons for not looking contribute to the development of surprises, then one wants to look at the further implications of surprise.
Well, and also, Rob, I was also thinking that, as we attempt to show, was Lisbeth here, or as I mentioned, this before amplification work that we've been doing, there we analyzed this issue of risks related to the chicken feed paper, as you call it, Rob. And we see very clearly there then actually how let's say the surprise stage of the development in many ways makes the previous attenuation more visible, or it kind of helps to articulate or kind of explain, oh, there's Lisbeth, relate, so I think also there's a mechanism there that actually a surprise can contribute to at least bring forward or make the previous drift clearer or more understandable, at least, when you can connect it to a specific event or surprise like that. So the event makes it, let's say, comprehensible in a different way. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm thinking, but
I agree.
Yeah. What do you think, Lisbeth? I'm not sure how much of the presentation you managed to listen to. People were asking for you at the beginning here.
Came a bit late, and I've been listening to almost everything and all the comments, but now I have to go again.
Okay.
That's why I'm turning my camera on and off. I'm standing in the door as we speak, so sorry for not being able to participate more.
Well, I'll tell you all about it when we meet at work later on.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, well, that was just what I was thinking. That surprises. I'm not sure that not exactly your point, Rob, but just that there is, I think, a connection there between, let's say, attenuation and amplification. In many ways, they are also related, and they connect in a way. Yeah. Sometimes we need the amplification to see the attenuation.
Yeah, there are 2 points. One is that the nature of the amplification or attenuation changes over time, but it also changes depending on who's listening or looking, as you were saying.
Well, I was also wanting to ask you, Paul, based on your early remark on this new context of unreliability, or how you put it. How is this relevant moving forward in that type of an organizational context? If you're still there, Paul.
Yes, I'm here. Well, you've asked a question I don't necessarily know the answer to here, but I think that we have to really recognize that organizations are going to be faced with surprises, many more surprises, because we can't specify the range of behavior of all the participants in these networks. And sometimes the technology is of such a complex order that we don't have time, or we don't have the inclination to actually test it out over generations before it's implemented. I mean, think about artificial intelligence. It's already implemented before people even have a chance. It's immature technology being implemented, so there's going to be a lot of surprises. And I don't understand how, I mean, from my framework in high reliability organizations, I see a huge difficulty in coupling reliability to surprise. Emery Rowe and I have been looking at issues in what would be disaster management in Oregon and Washington, American states that are bordered by a huge tectonic plate subduction. And every 300 years, there's a quake and a tsunami. The quake is usually of a 9.0 or higher, or as they've estimated. And so these states are looking at the consequences. What's going to happen if we have another one of these? The last one was 300 plus years ago. And they're trying to think about, emergency management and how to handle this. And the fact is, we've interviewed a whole bunch of emergency managers. And, we tried to say, well, how will you know when you're doing a good job? What does reliability mean? And I don't know what reliability means, and neither do they. What does it mean when you have all the infrastructures failing at once and people are incredibly dependent, and those infrastructures include the means of giving them food and water? What does good performance mean? What does reliability mean? And, one person says, reliability is we follow the action rules that we've set out. But when you ask them more carefully, they'd say, oh, those are going to go out the window. Our plans are going to go out the window because we don't even know the kinds of consequences that are going to come from a quake this high. So then the question is, what does reliability mean? Now, what can you say about safety? Maybe there are things you can say about safety where you don't have to consider reliability. You actually can be safe even when you're confronted with lots of surprises. And I don't know. I don't know the answer to how you can try to promote safety when you are going to be confronted with lots of surprises. Sorry to leave you with this confusion. If somebody can sort it out for me, I would love to hear some other ideas about this.
One day, Paul, you're going to become a glass half full guy. We're going to get you glass half full.
Well, at least I think what of course this isn't an answer to this, Paul, but at least if we look at safety, not just, let's say, if we look at it as a value, that's something we people put on let's say a process or an activity or a technology, and where we then all have to also answer the question, well, what is then safe enough? What do we, let's say, expect, or what is the limit that we can expect, or that we are, let's say, satisfied with? I think again there is an important connection then between, let's say, doing your best to develop reliability and safety and give people or the best possible, let's say, tools or capacities that you can. And I think that if you've done that before a surprise, I think people will appreciate that afterwards, while acknowledging that there is uncertainty, while acknowledging that there are limitations in capacities, while acknowledging that there will be consequences. They will look at what did the actors, the systems, the organizations actually do before, and that will have implications for how, let's say, safety and reliability, if we can also include reliability in that, is understood and maybe also restored in that context of surprise.
Right. And actually, let me just point out that these two states have now told their citizens that they need to follow a 2-week survival strategy. That is, they need to assume they're not going to be able to be rescued, or maybe even not given water, certainly not electricity, and they need to be self-sufficient in their area for at least 2 weeks. And they even have sent out brochures how to handle liquid and solid wastes, how to dig ditches, different kinds of ditches. So, I mean, one thing is, I think it requires tremendous imagination. And one of the things we saw in HROs is people say, oh, they're managing the unexpected. Actually, they didn't manage the unexpected. They wouldn't be HROs if they had to confront the unexpected all the time. But what they did was they enlarged expectancies. They thought about the worst case. People scored points in those organizations by coming up with weird chains and concatenations that could cause a particular event. So it may be that sort of imagination harnessed, generated, is a first step. I don't know. Beats me.
Well, I'm not going to answer this either, but I can't resist commenting that a couple of things. One is that when there's that much uncertainty about what's happening, a bright line saying something is safe enough is not a good idea, and that one needs to take a much more adaptive approach. And as Paul was just saying, be imaginative and look beyond what people have already thought about. And the other thing is that there are ways of being better prepared for uncertain circumstances, and one can develop that. And it's not safety and it's not reliability, but it's making things better rather than worse.
I'd like to address some of the comments that the commission made in terms of fines or penalties.
See, you're absorbing that, Kenneth. So that's good. We're running about out of time. So
yeah. No, I was not wanting to. I thought that was some nice last words. I wasn't wanting to comment on that. I think that's
Well, the wonderful thing is hopefully Kenneth is going to join us later on in the year for the HRO 40 celebrations. We're going to try and get them over here so we can continue these discussions. But thank you so much for being available today and participating. Thanks for everybody on the call. As I noted in the chat, within a day or so, I'll get the recording posted as well as the slides, so you can go back and take a look. And with that, I think we'll bring the meeting to a close. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kenneth. That was wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone, for input and comments, discussions, everything really, really helpful and valuable for us working with this. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.